Well, I've been that diner alone in a restaurant, and I have been on that park bench watching the world go by and friends shaking hands and thinking, I'm not sure the world is a wonderful place. In my loneliness, I wondered. I know you've been that person too. But I realized that being alone or being lonely is not the enemy. The enemy is the isolation that we create in our lives. Now we're into the second week of our sermon series, Connect, how we are connecting or missing connections with each other, self, and God in our time. That's the series we're in. It comes under the banner of the theme year about what it means to be human in these times. Our time, 2019. Our time is this era of God knows what. Only history will really explain it. We know we are told that these are unprecedented times, characterized by signs of communal fraying and isolation and disconnection. We understand this even while we are the most connected we have ever been through the miracles of things like computer science. Our lives are exposed to and expanded to the globe. Right now, this sanctuary is open to someone on the other side of the world through our live streaming. That has never happened before in our history. We are connected, and yet we understand that we are in an unprecedented time where rates of loneliness and isolation skyrocket. Search the New York Times with the word isolation. Go ahead later today and do that. You will find article after article telling us about the epidemic of isolation and loneliness, explaining that we live disparate lives cut off from one another that threaten not only our communities, but our very health and well-being. We know that no other era has allowed such amazing connectivity, yet we have this feeling of disconnection. We have the ability to peer into places we will never go, meet people online we will never touch, and yet we feel alone. In part, this is due to social media, the social media era we are in that allows people to hide behind their computer identities, to bully or threaten. We see that at the highest levels. It allows us to compare ourselves with people we will never meet in person or know. It allows us to connect through this thin wall of electronics and become experts on just about any topic and demand that our opinion is the truth and should be heard. Perhaps what we are doing to ourselves is isolating who we are and what matters to us far more than who we can be for each other. And this is the realm of isolation. I was thinking about times in my life when I felt really deeply connected. And I thought back to the first half of my life when I lived on a kibbutz, a communal farm in Israel. I lived in a clump of housing with people my age from around the world, volunteers, in the midst of a community of Israelis and Argentinian Jews. We worked in the fields, growing cotton and carrots and potatoes. And on the Sabbath, we spent the whole day enjoying each other in this small community of 200 or 300 people. All the children lived in their own houses or their own homes, which made all the children our children. Families spent the Sabbath on the front of their houses with anybody who wanted to drop by. And we lived in the desert, so we'd spent most of the day outdoors. But it struck me that there was also isolation, if not loneliness, there. For one, we lived inside a barbed wire perimeter guarded by towers, armed gunmen on each corner. We were cut off from the people we lived near, suspicious and tribal. The sense of us and them permeated our everyday activities. And some were isolated for what they did. One friend, a father of 2 young children, I'll call him Ari. Ari was a great guy in the kibbutz. He and I spent time together in the fields, driving tractors and moving hoses and all kinds of things. And his other part-time job was to fly Tomahawk helicopters and drop missiles on villages in Lebanese and Syrian areas when he was called in. I imagine that him sitting there in the kibbutz frying potatoes with his friends and family and the kibbutz felt a kind of disconnect with the life he lived in his military service. And this is where I think the core message is for us today. I know we often feel lonely, but I worry more about isolation. And isolation is not just living remote in some far off place. It's feeling disconnected with who we are and what we are doing. We can feel lonely, we can seek friendships, but we know our lives are incoherent with who we want to be when we know a deeper isolation. And life can feel that way for sure. We see the character in Billy Collins's poem, Dining Alone. The man in the poem, I assume, is the poet who eats alone and is aware of his aloneness in public. The poem is a kind of short allegory for life, where we live surrounded by people. We are expected to behave this way or that, enjoying the community. We are ultimately, though, alone. But the poet's purpose is clear. So he does not degrade his life when he closes the door to his apartment and call it lonely and isolating. What he calls it is the purpose of his life. He is content to close the door, knowing a coherence in his life exists in his writing poetry. David Brooks puts it this way: there is always a tension between self and society, between the individual and the group. Over the past 60 years, we have swung too far to the self. The only way out is to rebalance, to build a culture that steers people toward relation, community, and commitment, the things we deeply yearn for, yet undermine with our hyper-individualistic way of life. He warns us that if we don't connect, we perish. He warns us that if we don't connect who we are with the way we act in the world, we perish by isolation. Now here's the truth. Being alone and lonely is not the enemy. Isolation is the enemy. I need to be alone. I am introverted enough that I need to recharge on quiet evening walks or riding my bicycle. Some of the best sermons I've ever written were written rolling through Sunnyvale all alone on my bike. But that isn't what Brooks is warning us about, being alone or lonely. Isolation is the enemy in society. Isolation is living by making incessant comparisons with other people's lives. It's deliberate disconnection with others. It's a self-imposed, self-protected life sentence which fears how connectivity can become vulnerability. Isolation is not the death of a spouse or the loss of a roommate or family member or taking a long solo walk. Isolation is disconnection with reality, loss of purpose, not being challenged in our ideas or opinions, preferring to be right among no one. It is what we do on social media, looking for strokes instead of dialogue. It is unfriending people on Facebook because they disagree with us and threaten our opinions. It is being out of touch with the world. I realized something about isolation this week. A group of clergy were meeting at Thanksgiving Square. We took up in earnest, at my behest and at the urging of my friend, the senior minister at Wilshire Baptist, George Mason, that we talk about the response that we might have to the Amber Geiger trial. Now, hang in there with me. I'm just going to run it down for you. Just to recap, remember that we're concerned about this. Police officer Amber Geiger, a white woman off duty, walked into what she says she thought was her apartment about a year ago, where a black man, Botham Jean, was watching football alone, sitting in front of his television, and Geiger, who was on a floor below in the wrong apartment, thought she was being robbed and shot Botham Jean dead. That's what she says. The truth may never be known what really happened. What is known is that this city has a history of police brutality against the black community, that we live with a legacy of racism, that we live with the legacy of stirring social issues and class that play into this trial and its outcome. So my question to the clergy gathered there was, does the justice system work the same for everyone? And how much will this case divide or heal the north-south divide in our city? And how are we all going to be in this together? The questions were asked knowing that we, the faith leaders, will be called on to make statements, to attempt to hold our city together, to speak to the realities of what's going on in our city, and to try to do some good rather than harm. What interests me in this conversation was, as I looked around the room, I realized the reliance by the North Dallas clergy on the foundation, or you might say, the theology of peace at all costs. That and a belief that the system will work for everyone, that what we were to promote would be peace at all costs. That's what the North Dallas clergy were saying. And the South Dallas clergy spoke up and questioned whether peace was the answer. They had a better frame for us to consider, which was, how will we witness to the suffering in our city no matter what happens? In this conversation, I felt the North Dallas clergy were out of touch. They were expressing their isolation from the people in the south of our city. The realities of the black citizens in the south of our city, their history, and the potential that business as usual, if Geiger is acquitted or given a reduced sentence, what that would do to all of us. I noticed the South Dallas clergy warning us not to stand on the foundation of peace, but to embody a God who stands with those who suffer. And I remembered the words of Jeremiah the prophet, who was speaking to those who wanted peace and ignored the suffering of his community, who said, "They dress the wound of my people as though it were not serious. Peace, peace, they say, when there is no peace." Being isolated means being out of touch and being ignorant of each other. Our answer as clergy was to plan to convene conversations with North and South Dallas clergy to prepare for the acquittal or the minor sentence or whatever might happen, to prepare our hearts to witness for God and see suffering in our society, and to hope that the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice. You see what I'm saying? When we isolate ourselves, we perpetuate crimes against one another. We build up assumptions that buffer us from reality. If Geiger is acquitted, most of us in this room will be able to shake our heads at the news and move on to the next NPR story about a famous composer or bird sanctuary. While some in our city will face riots and anger-fueled violence, which will be followed by condemnation and more isolation. You see, isolation from each other breaks our connectivity in ways that is more serious, more worrying than our own existential sense of loneliness, as real as that also can be. Brooks says, David Brooks, my new prophet. You should read the book, it's good. He says, to combat this isolation, we must do something contrary to what we might think he's going to say. What he says is we have to move toward joy. Joy means transcending ourselves. It's the chipping away of the barriers between us. It's communal, it's emotional, it's spiritual, it's transcendence. All those things point to the loss of self-differentiation, self-actualization, self-gain. It's what the mystics call becoming one with God in community. Or a hiker might describe as where I stop and the world of boundaries and the natural world invades my being. And then he says something interesting. He says we have to cultivate a moral joy. It's not just brain chemistry, but a permanent state when our actions align with our commitments. It is connections that mean something to who we are, not just what we do. It is finding our way beyond ourselves to a holy purpose. It is what we invite you to do here today and most days. To move toward life with a holy purpose that transcends worldly gain and worldly glory. We ask you to consider what kind of person you know yourself to be. And then what purpose can you apply yourself to be, whether it grand or simple? And then to love yourself through and through to a moral joy in the world. That moral joy inevitably pulls us from our isolation and our disconnection to a care for the world. A care that goes beyond our opinions or our protection of ourselves, to a drive toward each other. Now, our odds are stacked that we can't do this because we feel like loneliness is the barrier, but the real danger to ourselves is isolation. So our invitation to you is to connect, to be informed, to reach beyond yourself to purpose that pulls you toward a moral joy, a joy that is infinite and lives in finding joy itself. Miroslav Volf, a professor at Yale who studies joy, talks about how joy is a cyclical building of purpose and meaning in our lives. He says joy is not merely external to the good life, a mint leaf on the cake's whipped cream. Rather, the good life expresses and manifests itself in joy. When he says the good life, I say purpose, connection with who we are and what we are about. Joy is the emotional dimension of life that goes well and that is led well, a positive, affective response to life going well and life being led well. And it starts in connection. Those of you in church today are invited to connect. There are tables for conversation and hearing each other into speech. There are groups here that call you to leave your comfort zone and groups that call you to be comforted in your struggles. Now, if you leave here this morning and never take us up on this invitation, you're welcome to come back any day and start again. But today is a day to begin a chapter of connection that bends toward joy. And I promise you, it does. You are invited to help build a moral joy in our community, one group, one conversation, one effort at a time. Because the joy of our community is that to be a Unitarian Universalist means to work toward two things: constantly opening our hearts and constantly engaging in the real world. To connect, to learn from each other, to listen quietly to God, to seek friendships that feed the soul, and ultimately to live in community that does not reject us if we sing out of tune, for instance. Doesn't walk out on us because we fail each other. That's the joy of this community. That's these people who are sitting around you. That's this place. A place that combats isolation and pulls us toward purpose and hope. Can I get an amen? Amen. I love when you do that. So outside your comfort zone. In the end, we need each other. That's why we do things like Connection Sunday or any kind of worship. Even if we feel alone or lonely in the pews with our family, our friends, surrounded by 300 people in this sanctuary, we know that this place is about combating isolation, connecting us to purpose. We know that this community is a community of friends. Now, I want to bring up the band to lead us in our closing song. We're not going to sing a hymn. Done right, this song should preach the end of this sermon, because it says with friends we can get past a lot of things. We cannot fail one another. We can find joy in connections that we make. 50 years and a month ago, Joe Cocker sang this to 500,000 people in Bethel, New York, to a group that was trying to connect to purpose and peace and love. So, in a way, we're going to bring that back 50 years and a month later. But first, I want you to rise as you're able and say a responsive, one-time only benediction. That after each line of my benediction, your line is with a little help from my friends. Let me hear it. Go in peace. Walk softly on your path. And may God shine on you all the days of your life. Amen.
What would you do if I sang out to? Would you stand up and walk out on me? Lend me your ears and this land